Your alarm goes off at 6:45. You're already exhausted before your feet hit the floor. You assume this is just modern life being modern life, that somewhere in the past, humans had it easier, slower, more in tune with their bodies. You'd be wrong about almost all of it. A hunter-gatherer living 40,000 years ago had a day that looked nothing like the campfire and sunset fantasy you're picturing, and in some ways it looked uncomfortably similar to yours. Let's start where you'd expect the biggest difference: sleep. You assume early humans slept long, deep, uninterrupted hours, lulled by darkness with no screens to ruin it. Sleep researcher Jerome Siegel led a landmark study tracking 3 modern hunter-gatherer societies: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, groups whose lifestyles closely resemble ancient human existence. Using wearable sensors over more than 1,000 combined nights, his team found something almost nobody expected. These groups slept an average of 6.5 hours a night. Not 9, not 10, 6.5, nearly identical to what you're getting right now, sometimes less. They didn't even go to sleep at sundown. Researchers found they stayed awake more than 3 hours after dark before drifting off and woke up before sunrise, almost the exact same pattern many modern adults follow without realizing it's ancient. So if you've ever blamed your phone for ruining your sleep, the data suggests something less comfortable. Maybe the problem was never really the screen. Now picture your workday. 8 hours, sometimes more, hunched at a desk, staring at the same 4 walls, exhausted by 5 o'clock for reasons you can't quite explain. Anthropologist Marshall Salins, drawing on detailed fieldwork from researchers studying the Kungsan and the Hadza, estimated that hunter-gatherers typically spent only 3 to 5 hours a day actually obtaining food. Anthropologist James Woodburn's research on the Hadza specifically found that across an entire year, they spent an average of less than 2 hours a day finding food. Once they had enough, they stopped. There was no overtime, no quota, no manager checking in. This single fact destroys one of the most persistent myths about prehistoric life: the idea that survival was a brutal, non-stop grind from sunrise to sunset. For most hunter-gatherer societies studied, it wasn't. Once basic needs were met, the rest of the day belonged to them. What did they do with that time? Rest, socializing, storytelling. According to ethnographic accounts, Hadza men in particular spent a notable portion of their day on games of chance, essentially gambling, an activity anthropologists have specifically documented as a major leisure pursuit. Picture that for a second. A caveman with more free time in his day than you have in your entire week, and he's spending part of it playing dice games with his friends. Of course, this picture isn't universal. Researchers studying the Acta people of the Philippines found that those who shifted from foraging toward farming actually worked roughly 10 hours more per week than their forager neighbors, and lost leisure time specifically tied to that shift, particularly the women. The transition away from hunting and gathering, the one history often frames as progress, may have made daily life measurably harder for many people, not easier. So here's where the comparison gets uncomfortable. You wake up exhausted on roughly the same sleep schedule your ancestors had 40,000 years ago. You then spend 8, 9, sometimes 10 hours working, far more than the 3 to 5 hours most hunter-gatherer societies spent obtaining what they needed, only to come home with less daylight leisure time than a Hadza forager had on an average Tuesday. Anthropologist Marshall Salins called this concept the original affluent society. The idea that hunter-gatherers, despite owning almost nothing, may have experienced more genuine leisure and lower stress than people in modern industrialized economies. Not because their lives were easy. Hardship, disease, and early death were real risks they faced that you mostly don't, but the specific daily rhythm, work until needs are met, then stop, has almost entirely vanished from how most people live now. This raises an uncomfortable question about what exactly all that extra work bought you. You have climate control, modern medicine, instant food, and entertainment available at any hour. Your ancestor had none of that. But your ancestor also wasn't checking a phone at 11 p.m., wasn't commuting 2 hours a day, and likely wasn't lying awake calculating how many emails were waiting for the morning. Your alarm will go off again tomorrow at 6:45. You'll feel exhausted in roughly the same way a Hadza forager might have felt 40,000 years ago, on roughly the same amount of sleep. The difference is what happens in the hours after you get up, hours that, for most of human history, would have ended hours earlier than yours does today.